And can anybody name maybe a couple of those foundations that we looked at last time we were here together? Yes. Yes. He is creator. If God is our creator and authority, then when we think about sexuality, we have to say, what does our creator say about sexuality? We have to go back to Him. We're made in God's image, and part of being made in God's image, it appears in the text of Genesis, is that we are made male and female. How important is that for our day? What else did we look at? Does anybody else remember the other thing we saw in Genesis? We looked at marriage, didn't we? In chapter 2, we looked at marriage, and we looked at those verses, and we saw God's original plan for marriage, that it has not changed. And we saw the reason, the theological reason, why Eve was taken out of Adam. So when people are married today, when a man and woman are married today, it's a coming back together. It's a reuniting. And that's something that cannot happen between a man, a woman and a woman, because woman was taken out of man at the beginning. Okay? What we're going to look at tonight, I want to see mainly three things tonight. First thing I want to see is one more foundation, and then I want us to look at some deviations from God's plan, and then I want us to get down, and I think we'll have time tonight, I want us to get down, and I want us to see, why is it that all this sexual sin's that bad after all? I mean, what's so bad about this? You got people over here, they're at their own house. You got people over here, they're minding their own business. What's the big deal about all this? Why can't we just let people believe and do what they want? Why do we try to... What is it that makes it so bad? So we're going to see some of that a little bit later. So I want you to turn to Genesis 3. And I want us to look at one more foundation here. One more foundation. And I think I mentioned this last week, and I didn't really plan on talking about it. And today I was thinking, you know what, we need to look at this. So we're going to spend at least a little bit of time looking at another foundation. Now this foundation of biblical sexuality is different than the other ones. The other ones that we have seen are good. Creation, made in God's image, male and female, marriage. This foundation is different because it's actually the fall of man. And when we think about sexuality, for us to really understand the position that we are in today, we have to understand that we are fallen people. If we don't understand that, we're going to be in bad trouble. And you'll hear questions sometimes, and maybe you've had loved ones or family members, or maybe you've seen things on the internet, articles written about stuff like this. And you'll hear people talk about, would God give me these desires and not want me to act upon them? Any of you ever heard anything like that? You'll hear people talk about that. Or you'll hear someone say something like this, God created everything good, so why are these desires I have bad? And if all we know is God's good creation, and we don't understand that we've actually fallen, then we'll misunderstand what the Bible is actually teaching us. So let's look at a few places here. We won't spend too long on this. But just look in chapter 3 and look in verse 6. Chapter 3, verse 6. It says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Now that doesn't seem so bad, does it? The pastor I used to be under in Tennessee, he talked about like a parent telling a child, hey, don't take that piece of candy, and the child picking up that candy and eating it. And most people think that's not a big deal. And what this pastor was saying is, that's an act of rebellion against the parent. And what we have here is, it's not the big thing is not simply that Adam and Eve ate of a piece of fruit. That's not the big thing. The big thing is it was an act of rebellion on their part. They were saying in effect, hey, this is my world. I'll make my own rules. I'll do my own thing. This is me, me, me. I'm going to listen to the serpent, the devil, as opposed to God. In fact, I think I know better than God. We see this rebellion happening. And there in chapter 3, what we see is the fall of man. The fall of man. Now, let me say two things about Adam's role in the fall of man. One thing is this. First of all, Adam was the first male, Adam and Eve, first people. And what we see is through simply procreation, we see sin being passed down through procreation. We also see something else here, though, is that not only is sin passed down simply because of procreation, we see Adam as our representative. And I think sometimes we like to, and I probably have thought this, at least in theory, if I was there, or maybe somebody says to themselves, if I was in the garden, I wouldn't have fallen. What we have here is the perfect man, the perfect woman, in the perfect place. They have no sin nature. And he is our perfect representative, and because of the sin of Adam, sin has been passed down now from generation to generation to generation to every single person born of woman. Can anybody think of a famous verse in Psalm 51 that speaks along these lines? Does that verse come to mind, where David talked about sin? I was conceived in iniquity. I was brought forth in sin in my mother's womb. It talks about that, Psalm 51. And listen, I don't have to tell you this, do I? Children are so wonderful, they're so cute, and yet you don't teach them to do bad things, do you? Am I right? Do you have to teach them to be selfish? No. We're all born sinners. Each and every one of us are born into sin. Look in chapter 5 of Genesis. And just let's read the first 3 verses, and I think we see the change here that happens. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and He blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Now, we are all made in God's image still. The Bible affirms that. And I think at least part of what we see, though, in verse 3, it says of Adam, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image. I think what we see there is not only are we made in God's image, but now we have this sin nature. We're made in the image of Adam as well. And we come into this world with different desires for evil. We're all different, and yet we're all sinful people. And the greatest problem that we have is not sins in the plural. The greatest problem we have is sin in the singular. We are in sin, therefore that's why we do sins in our life. So I just want to mention that. We could look at other verses, but I won't go any further tonight probably on that. But when you think, especially for you all, you're trying to talk to a family member, you're trying to help someone understand what the Bible teaches, we must start with creation. We must start with made in God's image, male and female. We must talk about marriage and how God created marriage. But one of the foundations for our understanding of reality right now is the fall of man. We are not the way God made us to be. And we have to understand that if we're going to understand our world. So is there any comments on that before we move on? We'll turn back to chapter 4 of Genesis. And what I want us to do, and we won't read all these verses, but I want us to spend some time now looking at deviations from God's plan. What type of sexual sins, and it's kind of, in one sense, it's kind of hard to look at all these, to think about all these, and we won't read all these stories. It's kind of hard to see what the Bible describes here. Not because it's not true, it's just because it's so terrible. By the way, that's one of the many ways that we can know the Bible is inspired. That the Bible doesn't pull any punches. Some of its main characters are shown to be terrible sinners in the Bible. Abraham is shown to be a liar. Peter is shown to deny his Lord. And so forth and so on. And what we see in the Bible are some of these terrible, terrible sins. Have any of you ever heard of the book, The Epic of Gilgamesh? We had to read that in college, and I should have looked it up. It may be a Babylonian document. I can't remember for sure. But it's thousands of years old. And what you have there is different things, but one of the things you see in the Epic of Gilgamesh is this author that's thousands of years behind us, away from us, is describing these terrible sins, describing things. And that helps us to understand that when the Bible talks about these awful, wicked things, it's just talking about reality. It's talking about the way life was. What we see here in the Bible, what we're getting ready to see are some very terrible things. It's caused by sin. We start here in chapter 4, though. What is the first deviation from God's plan for sexuality? And like most things, the first deviation on one level is not, in the eyes of some people, that terrible. We may say it was a gradual falling away from God's plan. If you look here in verse 19, you see a man named Lamech. And on down in verse 23 and 24, it describes him as it appears, not a righteous man. He kills a man, and then it seems like he boasts about killing a man, how bad he is. He boasts about that. But he, at least in the recording of the Bible, is the first person to depart from God's plan of sexuality. And this is how it happens, verse 19. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. So what we see here at the very beginning, I'm not for sure how many years after the fall of man, is we have now not one man and one woman, but we have one man and 2 women. We see polygamy here. This was the first deviation of God's plan. And what you find in the Bible, as you look at the Bible, you'll see some of God's great heroes with multiple wives. That does not mean it was right. It was sinful for them to have multiple wives. But we see here a deviation from that. If you turn on over to Genesis chapter 6, I'll mention this briefly because I don't believe that this is speaking about what some people think about. I believe, let me read verse 2. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The way I take this verse is that it's the godly people marrying the ungodly people here. So that is a deviation from God's plan. Some people, though, take this as actually the sons of God are angels coming down and having sexual relationships with women here. There's a lot of Christians, even ancient writers, who take it that way. I don't take it that way, but I just mentioned that to you. Turn to chapter 9. We have polygamy already begun, and now we see another sexual deviation. This is about the story of Noah. Noah is a man of faith. The New Testament calls him a man of righteousness. He's a preacher of righteousness, is what it says. And yet, Noah is a great story, a great account for us to warn us that it doesn't matter who we are, what we've done. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship we have with God. All of us can fall. Noah grows a vineyard. Noah drinks of the wine. He drinks too much. He becomes drunken. And his sin helps lead to one of his son's sins here. And we pick up in verse 22. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Now, the Bible doesn't give us too many details. We know that Ham's son is cursed because of this. And it appears what happens is, it doesn't give any details of anything sexually happening. What we see is a son seeing his father, and it's not just simply seeing his father, I think, but it's maybe he made fun of his father. Maybe he said something he shouldn't have said to his brothers. But you see something sexual happening here. A deviation from God's plan of chastity and purity. Chapter 19, of course, is one of the most, if not the most famous accounts in the Bible of sexual sin. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, this is thousands of years ago. This is not America or some other country today. This is thousands and thousands of years ago. Let's just read two verses here. Verse 4. Before they lay down, the men of the city... Now, what has happened here, I should have said this, I guess. Two angels who appear as men have come into the city. Lot has welcomed them into his house. And it says in verse 4, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old. All the people from every quarter. So you have these people in this house, and they are surrounded by men from all over the city. What happens is the angels will strike them with blindness, but look what it says in verse 11. They struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. These men are struck with blindness, and they're still trying to find the door to get in and do their sinful things. So very early on, we see polygamy, we see what happened to Noah, and now we see here homosexuality, and also we can say rape, at least attempted rape. I want us to see something else in Genesis 19, but is there any questions there about Sodom and Gomorrah before we go on? Well, later on in chapter 19, we see Lot, and the Bible in the New Testament says that as Lot was in Sodom, I believe it says that his righteous soul was vexed. He did not like to live in Sodom. He didn't like that lifestyle. And here what you have is Lot and his two daughters. His two daughters make him drunk, and they have sexual relationships with their father, and we see incest here. Again, another deviation from God's plan. You can go ahead and turn to Leviticus 18 now. We'll look at two things there. As you're turning there, Genesis 34 speaks about rape. You see other things in the book of Genesis. But as you turn to Leviticus, you get into the holiness code. And we'll look at one prohibition against homosexuality here. Verse 22 of Leviticus 18. Verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. And then in verse 23, we won't read this, but verse 23 talks about animals. People and animals. The Bible deals with real life things here. And as we see these arguments for homosexuality and so forth go on and on and on, I'm sure there's numerous people in our world making the same arguments for this type of thing. Deuteronomy chapter 22. Verse 5. This is something very timely for our generation. And what we see in the Bible is everything in the Bible is timely. We do not have to make the Bible relevant. We just have to rightly interpret the Bible and rightly apply it to our day. It's always relevant. Chapter 22, verse 5. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. So you see here We may say cross-dressing for our day as well. Men thinking they're women, women thinking they're men, they're dressing up as others. The Bible says that's not right. Turn to Matthew 5 now. As you're turning there, 1 Samuel chapter 2 talks about the sons of Eli. They were priests and they were having sexual relationships. They're abusing their authority. They're abusing their place. We see that in the Bible, unfortunately. And then in Matthew 5, we have Jesus speaking about divorce. Now, we're very thankful that people can be divorced, they can remarry, God can bless that marriage. If there's wrongdoing in the past, they can ask God to forgive them. We're thankful for that. It's like one man said, it's not where you've been that matters, it's where you're going that matters. That's what matters. And yet, if all we talk about is homosexuality and so forth, and we never talk about divorce and other things, then, wow, we're really doing a disservice to the Bible, aren't we? So we have to talk about these things. Adultery as well. Let's just read this one verse, Matthew 5, verse 32. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. For whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So we have Jesus there speaking about divorce. He'll speak about it other places in the Gospels. Paul will speak about it as well. So that is just a very quick look at how we go from creation, we go from being made in God's image, being made male and female, about marriage being between a man and a woman, and now we come here, unfortunately, Adam and Eve fall into sin, and from that we have all this sexual sin. And our culture is no different, is it? Our culture is no different. Well, is there any comments or questions there about what we've just looked at how in the Bible people departed from God's original plan for sexuality?
I want about Leviticus 19 when it just comes to the law in general and the holiness code, because I have had conversations with people in the past that are like, oh, well, the law also says don't be shellfish, and the law also says don't wear multi-patterned clothing, and then it says this too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're doing this nowadays. Christians do these things. What's wrong with Christians doing this? Like,
right.
In terms of homosexuality.
Right.
And just in general, the stuff in the law that is still considered sinful.
Right.
So I guess what would be, a biblical solid response to that?
Yeah. I think you've put your finger on probably one of the biggest objections to the Bible's teaching on homosexuality, is people say things like this. They say, you know what, that's nice. You have those verses about homosexuality in Leviticus. Well, Leviticus says not to shave your beard a certain way too. It says not to eat pork. So how do we deal with that? Turn to 1 Corinthians 7. Actually, I'm sorry, hold your place in 1 Corinthians 7 and then turn to 1 Timothy 1. I want us to look at two verses maybe, and then I want to say a little bit about that, because there's a very old, maybe 1,000 years or so, way of interpreting the Old Testament law that I find very helpful today. Many people have used it before. So in 1 Timothy 1, we see Paul speaking about the law. Verse 8, he says, "But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully." And what you see there, he goes down, he lists a number of sins. And to some degree, he follows the 10 Commandments. Maybe he follows them exact. He goes through the 10 Commandments, perhaps, through all these different sins and things. But it's very important there. He says, but we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. So there's such a way to use the law of God today that's not lawful. I think one of those ways, you can turn to 1 Corinthians now, chapter 7. One of the ways that people use the law of God wrongly today is when they say, hey, the law says not to eat pork, therefore if you want to be a good Christian, don't eat pork. If that's your personal conviction, that's perfectly fine. I have no problem about somebody saying, you know what, I think it's sinful for me to eat pork. I'll say, that's perfectly fine. Because the Bible talks about issues of conscience. That's fine, brother. That's fine, sister. The problem becomes when someone like that says, oh, but you have to do what I'm doing as well. That's when the problem comes. But here in 1 Corinthians 7, we see a very important principle in verse 19. Let me ask you a question before we read this, you all. Is circumcision a commandment in the Bible, in the Old Testament? Sure it was. Was circumcision important to the Jewish people? Very important. So circumcision was a command. Circumcision's in the Old Testament. Look what Paul says here in verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Now, isn't circumcision a commandment? It certainly is. But what we have here is Paul is making a distinction between circumcision and the commands of God. And it's like a friend of mine said once, he said something like this. He said, look at this, it says circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. But we can't say, well, the whole law's gone. Because do you actually think Paul could say that stealing is nothing or unstilling is nothing? Do you think Paul can say murder is nothing or unmurder is nothing? So what we find here is when we look back at the Old Testament with New Testament glasses, we begin to see that the authors of the New Testament made distinctions in certain laws. And I think this is the best way that I know of at least to look at it. There's 3 different types of law. One is a ceremonial law. One is a civil law. One is a moral law. Someone tell me what a ceremonial law would be in the Old Testament.
Like the way the priest washed their
Right, right. Washings, animal sacrifices for our sin. That is ceremonial law, we may say. Well, those laws are fulfilled. Christ has died in our place. You have the ceremony of the red heifer. Well, I think part of the red heifer, you would kill an animal, and it was about running blood, running water and things. I think part of that's fulfilled in the new birth, when Christ said you must be born of water and spirit. So you see the ceremonial laws have been fulfilled. What would be a civil law? First of all, if we talk about civil law today, what are we talking about when we say civil law? Right? It'd be for our country. It'd be our country's law, our state law, local law, civil law. So what we find is there's certain laws for the nation of Israel. And I believe this is where like the food laws, no pork, no shellfish, like was already mentioned tonight, come in. What we see is we're not the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel, there's a nation of Israel, but it's not Old Testament nation of Israel. And we have civil law that was only for Israel. And then when we look at the Old Testament, though, there's a certain type of law that we can say is moral law. It's always wrong to murder people. Doesn't matter if you're in Old Testament Israel or you're in some pagan country. It's always wrong to murder. It's wrong to lie. It's wrong to steal. And these sexual sins. So I hope that helps, is that when you read the Old Testament, there's distinctions there. There's distinctions made in ceremonial, civil, and moral law. That's the best way that I can understand it. And that's been very helpful to me. And I trust it's been helpful to other people. Is there any comments about that or questions? So it's very true that the Old Testament says not to eat pork, and yet in the New Testament, the Bible does away with those commands. But it never does away with homosexuality as being a sin. Okay? That's a very good question. Any other comments there about these sexual sins that we saw? All right, now let me ask this question then tonight. Why is all this wrong for? Why is it wrong? Why is it wrong for a man to have 10 wives or a wife to have 10 husbands? Why is that wrong for? Why is it wrong to not be married and to be like the communist wants us to be? No marriage anymore, no family, and all that would just... What's wrong with that? So let's think about this for a little bit. Why are all these sexual sins wrong for? God said it is. So we go back to the Bible. We believe it's the Word of God. God has made us in a certain way. God has said this is wrong, this is right. And we see how God created us. We see how we want to be, how we ought to be, at least. All right, that's very, very true. Anybody else? What else would make these things wrong?
Well, I guess the fact that it was the original intent, especially pre-fall of man, and I guess that kind of ties back to God said so, but our original design,
Right.
it's going against that.
Right. Right. We're made in a certain way. And we will only truly have peace. We have to know Christ, but we will only truly have peace if we live in the way that our Creator has made us to live. Very true. You know, I'm sure our country still talks about this. It talks about this thing is in the interest of the state. And at least it used to be about marriage and about having kids and family and things. That's in the interest of the state. So on one level, that helps us see what's right and wrong. Anybody else? Right. 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 Yeah. And I don't have any statistics. I didn't look before I came. But my understanding is if you have a family that's not together, a mother and father not together, crime and all kinds of things go very high in a family like that. We see things like that. That's very good. Male and female. That shows us something of the glory of God. That shows us something of the image of God. When we try to erase maleness and femaleness, we are trying to erase something of the glory of God being shown in the world. Can anything else come to your mind? I've got something I want us to see, but does anybody else have something? Oh my. Oh my. Yeah. Wow. And part of that, I think, is this. To be made in God's image, part of that, it appears, is to be male and female. And in your home, now we thank the Lord that there can be homes that aren't the way that God wants it, and maybe you and other people want it, and yet God can bless that home. We thank God for that. But if someone's in a home without a mother, or if someone's in a home without a father, you're not seeing something of God. Because God shows who He is in part through maleness and femaleness. The husband, the male, shows the strength of God. The male, they show the leadership of God. The female, it shows the tenderness of God. And though obviously we can see both male and female sharing these things, we know how men and women are made, right? So in a home without that, the children there are not seeing on one level a picture of who God is. Anybody else? Turn to Ephesians 5. Why are these sexual sins wrong for? Well, a number of reasons why, but here is a huge reason why. It's because these sexual sins do not show forth the relationship of Christ and His church. That is why God gave marriage. Now there's many reasons, I'm sure, why God gave marriage. It's not good for man to be alone. That's one reason. But God gave forth marriage to show us. Marriage is an illustration of Christ and His church. And when we lose what marriage is, when we lose that sense of sexuality and the way that God created us, we are not representing who Christ and His relationship with His church is anymore. Look down in verse 32. Look what it says. Paul says, this mystery is great. We're going to go back and see in a few minutes what that is. But he says, this mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Marriage, as wonderful as it is, as good and wholesome as it is, the highest thing that marriage does, I believe, is show us a picture of what it is for Christ and His church to be together. And if we lose that illustration of Christ's relationship with us, the church. So start back in verse 22, and let's go down this passage some at least. Let's see what Paul in part is saying here. Verse 22, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. We'll see more about that in verse 24. Look in verse 23. For the husband is the head of the wife. That's marriage. As Christ also is head of the church, He Himself being the Savior of the body. So what does the husband's relationship do in the marriage? It's an illustration of Christ's headship of the church. So when you see a husband lovingly having leadership over his wife, what you're seeing is a picture of Christ lovingly guiding His church. That's a picture of that. Look in verse 24. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be subject to their husbands in everything. When you see a godly wife submitting herself to her loving husband, what you see is this. You see a picture of the church on earth lovingly submitting herself to Christ's commands. That's what marriage is. And when you lose that dynamic and you lose that biblical understanding of marriage, you lose the illustration of Christ's relationship with His church. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives. What does that love show? Just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself up for her. You see a husband sacrificing himself literally for his wife, or a husband sacrificing his dreams for his marriage, and also we could say for his children. You see a husband sacrificing and loving his wife. What do you see? You see Christ giving Himself for the church. Look in verse 28. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. Why are we as husbands to love our wives like we love our own bodies for? Well, part of that is what? We're one flesh with our wife. Eve came out of the side of Adam. She is from our own body, but there's more than that. Verse 28 again, so husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. Verse 29, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. The church is Christ's body. And now when you get down to verse 30, because we are members of His body. And now verse 31, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What we have here is, the Bible says the husband is to love his wife as he loves his own body. Because they are one flesh now. Why are they one flesh? They are one flesh because Eve was taken out of Adam, and then they were reunited in marriage. They became one flesh. But what is that ultimately showing us is not simply that husbands and wives, that spouses are one flesh. That is showing us that when we become Christians, we are joined with Christ spiritually in His body. And then, verse 32, this mystery is great. But I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So if we lose marriage and we lose some of these things about sexuality that we're seeing in the Bible, we have lost the main purpose of marriage, which is to show Christ and His church. And then we'll finish reading verse 33 here. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. So marriage is so vitally important, but it goes way above society, as important as that is. We want strong marriages in society because strong marriages make strong societies. But marriage shows forth the glory of God. Marriage shows forth His creation. Marriage shows forth Christ's relationship with the church, us. So the stakes are raised really high when we talk about these things. Somebody wants to destroy marriage. Someone wants to do away with marriage. Some years ago, one wise man was talking about the homosexual agenda and how they did not want to redefine marriage. They wanted to do away with marriage. People hate marriage many times because ultimately, whether they understand where this hatred is directed to or not, they hate God, they hate His ways, they don't want to see Christ and His church, they want to break it all apart so they can be done with it, and yet they cannot be done with it. So when we think about these things, the stakes are high. The stakes are high here.